I'm walking outside an exact replica of the Parthenon from Greece, and I'll tell you, it's a pretty impressive building. I can only imagine what the original must look like in Greece. Look, I can understand why you might want to build a huge building like this, especially when they dedicated this building as a temple in the 5th century BC. You believe that your god, Athena, is a real god, and this is the temple where you come to worship her. Now, I'll tell you, I was a skeptical detective, and I was about 35, and I didn't believe in any of these ancient myths from the past, including Athena. But someone helped me open a Bible, and as I was reading through it, I was reading about Jesus of Nazareth, and I thought, is this guy just another ancient myth from the past? So I started to investigate it the way I would any cold case, and I examined every gospel that was written about Jesus, and here's what I discovered. Jesus is not just another myth from the past. He is very different than the goddess Athena. If you've ever read some of the ancient mythologies, they're really interesting, right? But it's pretty clear that the authors of these mythologies didn't think they were writing history. They weren't writing as eyewitnesses, for example. They were often writing hundreds of years after these things they were describing. And they never claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. Well, that's very different than the claims of the New Testament gospel authors. These folks actually said that they were disciples of Jesus, who knew him personally and knew his family. They had seen him preach, they had seen his life. That's a very different kind of claim, because if you want to lie about Jesus, just wait until everyone knows the truth is dead. But if you're going to write early in history, and that's the difference between the mythologies, written hundreds of years after the fact, and the Gospels, written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. Well, this is what makes them history rather than mythology. The story of Jesus is reliable. The story of Athena is simply fiction. You know, one of the things I noticed when I was reading the story of Athena, and this is true for all kinds of other mythologies as well, is that the story changes over time. Some of the earliest scholars believe that Athena was first represented as an owl or as a simple bird goddess, and then in later versions of the story, she becomes the protector of the king at the palace, and she's the goddess of crafts in the palace. And then later versions of the story, she's a god of wisdom and war. Why does the story change? Well, let's face it, if we're writing fiction, you can change the story all you want because it's not really true to begin with. Well, is that true of Jesus? Was he just kind of cobbled together as fiction from a bunch of other prior ideas about God? Well, I needed to research that, right? I needed to know. Here's what I discovered. I discovered that, no, he hasn't been borrowed from other mythologies. For example, the most important aspects of the Jesus story don't ever change. That he was born of a virgin, that he walked his ministry and preached a message of love and preached the gospel, that he worked miracles in front of his disciples, that he was crucified on a cross, put in a grave, was there for 3 days and then rose again and eventually ascended into the Father's presence. This is all stuff that is recorded. It doesn't change. That story does not change over the centuries. Well, why? Because that's the difference between fiction and history. If it really occurred, then you don't change the story, you just report the story. And that's the difference between the story of Athena and all the ancient gods and goddesses and the story of Jesus. These are fiction. Jesus is historic. The Apostle John was an eyewitness of Jesus, and he wrote an account in which he talked about everything he saw. And in chapter 14 of that account, he talks about a day when Philip asked Jesus, just show us the Father and we'll be content. Jesus responds and says, Philip, how long have you not been with me? If you're looking for God, look over here, is what Jesus always would say. That's a bold claim, to claim that you're God. If that's true, you should have huge impact, right? Wouldn't you think that was true? Well, it turns out Jesus had unparalleled impact. Look, we see that in this beautiful building, the image, the statue of Athena, she's apparently impacted the arts in some way, but no one has impacted the arts. No one's been drawn, painted, etched, sculpted, crafted more than Jesus of Nazareth, historically, in the West and in the world. No one's been sung about more than Jesus. No one's been written about in literature more than Jesus. None of Athena's followers have impacted education and science like the followers of Jesus have impacted education and science. As a matter of fact, even the other world religions acknowledge who Jesus is. Why? Because he's not just a person. He's the God of the universe, stepped into his creation. And here's what he had to say about you and I. We aren't God, and we make a lot of mistakes. And we're nothing like God. We do things we shouldn't do. That's the bad news. The bad news is that we're not God and we are separated from God. The good news is that Jesus gives us a way home. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father, to God, except through him. Well, that makes sense. If he's the true God, he'll be the only way to see the true God. Look at him, you'll see him. And here's what he tells all of us. He says, look, you think you can be as good as God so you can be in God's presence? Well, good luck with that. The Bible describes us as sinners. We just missed the mark. We're not perfect. We could never earn our way into God's presence. Only God can do that. But if you will simply embrace what Jesus says about himself, accept Jesus as Lord, believe in your heart, confess with your mouth that you can be saved. The bad news is that sin separates us from God. The good news is that Jesus brings us home anyway. All you have to do is accept the free offer. So that's where we're at. What do you do with the true God who changed the world and is not like any other prior mythology? It's all about making a decision, about accepting the free gift. Okay, now you know the truth. Jesus is not like some ancient myth, Athena or any other ancient myth of a lost culture. Jesus is history. Those are stories. Fiction, nonfiction, the real deal. That's who Jesus is. Now look, when it comes to God and Jesus, I still have some unanswered questions. We're all going to have some unanswered questions until we get right in front of Jesus and God, the Father, and we can ask those questions ourselves. But guess what? There's enough evidence for this. That evidence is pointing right to Jesus, not a foot to the left, not a foot to the right. It's going to stop slightly short. Those are your unanswered questions, but you've got more than enough evidence to take that step. Oh, and we're not going to call it a verdict. It's called a step of faith, not blind faith, a reasonable faith in light of the evidence. That's what you're doing when you're making a decision for Jesus. Now is the time for you to do something with him. Look, I remember reading C.S. Lewis years ago, an author who wrote this. He says, if Christianity is not true, it's of no importance. Just forget about it. If it is true, though, it's of infinite importance. Here's what it can't be, what it's never been: moderately important, just in the middle, like a lot of us are when it comes to issues related to God. I was that way. I didn't really care. I was in the middle. But once I determined that Jesus was the real deal, that changed everything. And I knew I had to act. I had to do something with the person known as Jesus. Well, now you know the truth. It's time for you to make a decision. It's not a blind step of faith. It's an informed step of faith. Now you know the truth. Just act on it. Do something with the person known as Jesus.